I'm Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We're watching Garry Kasparov face off against Leinier Dominguez from the 2017 St. Louis Rapid and Blitz. We have e4, e5. Will this be a Ruy Lopez? Garry has shown an affinity for the Ruy Lopez in the Blitz tournament since his retirement. Yes, he plays it, and Leinier responding with a Berlin. And Garry going knight c3, transitioning the game into the four knights. Knight d4, one of the most reputable systems. Very ambitious. Now, Garry could take on d4, he could take on e5, or he can ignore by castling or moving his bishop. Garry taking the first think of the game. Bishop a4 and bishop c4, I think, are the modern lines. Yep, bishop a4. And now Dominguez responding with bishop c5. Garry immediately capturing the pawn on a5. So this is a pawn sacrifice. Now, most likely it's temporary. As far as I remember, generally black ends up winning the pawn on e4 back after quick development. So I think Leinier is going to castle here. And oftentimes white brings the knight back to d3 in these kinds of situations to hit the bishop on c5 and pave the way for e5. Dominguez taking his time, and he castles. Garry immediately going knight d3, Dominguez bishop b6, and there's e5. Garry pushing that pawn, forcing Leinier's knight back to e8. And right now, Garry is up a pawn as he puts his knight on d5. The only issue with white's position is that Garry will have a hard time developing the dark squared bishop because it's currently being blocked by the knight on d3. So he's going after Dominguez's bishop on b6. He's up a pawn. I really like Garry's position out of the opening here. And now Dominguez taking a bit of a longer think. He goes c6, chasing the knight on d5, and Garry doesn't take the bishop on b6. That's a little bit surprising. He drops the knight back to e3, so maybe he just wanted to centralize the knight. He never wanted to take that bishop. Leinier going d5, expanding in the center. Now Garry could take en passant, but in that resulting position, the lack of development on the queen side could potentially hurt white. So I think it's in Garry's best interest to keep the position closed, and he does. He castles. He maintains the pawn on e5. Now, how is Leinier going to continue his initiative? Will he play f6, trying to open up the f-file for his pieces? Let's see. Yep, he plays f6, offering a trade. Garry chases the knight away from d4. Dominguez moves it to f5. Now, Garry could trade knights, but that would enable black's light-squared bishop to develop a tempo and hit that incredibly vulnerable knight on d3, which currently doesn't have any pawns defending it. So my guess is Garry's going to keep the tension and improve his position, but he needs to get that knight out of d3 in order to develop the bishop. Alternatively, he can fianchetto. But if he plays pawn to b3 here, then that bishop on a4 could end up getting trapped with a timely b7, b5. In fact, I think that loses the bishop after bishop takes c3, b5. And so Garry plays bishop c2. Very logical move. He gets the bishop out of a4. Now I think he can fianchetto his other bishop. He can go b3, and then either bishop b2 or bishop a3 to attack Leinier's rook on f8. I still like Garry's position. I think the onus right now is on Dominguez to prove his compensation. Maybe he'll do the same and go bishop c7, trying to force the trade of e5 takes f6. Or maybe he'll develop his light-squared bishop. Leinier taking a pretty long think here. You can see Garry with his hands over his head. He is deep in thought in a position. I like my position, but, I have to find different ways, to develop the bishop on c1. But, it's very successful opening against Dominguez. Leinier seems a little bit frustrated. He goes queen e7, and he attacks the pawn on e5. So this is a similar move to bishop c7. Now, will Garry take on f6? That, unfortunately, allows the knight on e8 back into the game. That's exactly what Dominguez wants. But how do you support the pawn on e5? Can you go f4? f4 is a pretty risky move as well, because then that basically self-pins the knight on e3 and creates weaknesses. Garry's shaking his head a little bit. He seems to be a little bit frustrated here. It is hard to untangle. This is a big decision. Does he take on f6? Does he go f4? Or does he give the pawn up on e5? I don't think he's going to do that. Taking a pretty long think here. And f4 does look pretty logical and tempting. That knight on e3 is pretty well protected by the pawn on d2. So I wouldn't be too worried about the pin imposed by the bishop on b6 should Garry play f4. And the other advantage of the move f4 is that it keeps the knight on e8 out of the game, because the pawn on e5 is what's restricting that knight on e8, not allowing it to join the game via f6. A long thing for Garry, who's getting himself in a fair bit of time pressure here. He's been thinking for right about a minute. And let's see what he comes up with. Doesn't show any signs of making a move just yet. This has to be good news for Leinier because the position remains incredibly complicated. This is going to be so hard to handle in time. And there it is, going for f4, a gutsy decision. And now he's got to be careful about his king safety. But this forces Leinier to continue trying to prove compensation for the pawn. Now, we could have a trade on e3 and then a trade on e5. That's one possible continuation. But maybe Leinier decides to keep the tension. But if he does that, how does he continue improving his position? Does he take on e5? Does he get his light squared bishop out to e6? That just seems a little bit flimsy. And now Garry, I think, is ready to play b3 and then maybe a4 and bishop a3. So White has a pretty clear plan of improving his position. Black, on the other hand, has a bit of a harder time improving his. Leinier, a little bit disconcerted here. He was about to make a move. Let's see if he takes one of White's pieces either on e3 or on e5. That would be my guess. That just seems like the most logical way to continue. But Leinier, there we go. Yep, he takes knight takes e3, pawn takes e3, and bishop out to f5. So he doesn't take the pawn on e5. Instead, he develops his light squared bishop, and now he's threatening potentially to take the knight on d3 and then take the pawn on e5. And that'll end up winning the pawn back. Garry with a very important decision here. Will he continue his plan of b3, a4, bishop a3, or will he take on f6? Now, he goes at a4 first. So this is a multi-purpose move. He wants to play a5 and chase away Black's bishop. What a move! And he also is preparing to play pawn b3 and then bishop a3. Now, Leinier could take the knight on d3 and take the pawn on e5, but that comes with certain risks as well. White's queen could jump out to h5 and threaten checkmate. Bishop c7 by Leinier, putting more pressure on e5. This might be high time for Garry to take on f6, but that lets the knight back into the game. And that knight now has access to that really, really weak e4 square, which White is weakened with a move f4. Garry instead going b3, keeping the tension and preparing bishop a3. What an interesting move. F takes e5 is probably going to happen, and Garry wants to respond to that with bishop a3, when Leinier will have to block that pin with his bishop and potentially relinquish his control over the e5 pawn. So Garry might actually be keeping his extra pawn here in a really interesting roundabout way. Leinier about to make a move, f takes e5 and bishop a3 instantly by Garry, bishop d6. We have a trade, and Garry's still with an extra pawn after knight takes e5. He's doing pretty well here. Ooh, but Leinier has an idea. Takes. And what about knight f7 here? What a move by Leinier. Now that contests the knight on e5. And if you take on f7, Black will take on e3 with check first and then recapture the knight on f7. And then Dominguez will have no problems at all. Garry could drop his knight back to g4, where it defends e3, but then the pawn h5 forces the knight off, pries its fingers off the ledge, and it looks like Leinier has managed to win the pawn back. What a sequence. Seeing knight f7, that wasn't easy at all, and that gets Garry into another think. I think for Garry, it's a decision between different ways of losing the pawn back, and then material will be equal. White has a bunch of weak pawns. The pawn on f4, the pawn on c3. All of White's queenside pawns are pretty flimsy. Black's pawn structure, on the other hand, is really, really healthy. So I think the position is approximately equal, but Garry's time situation is quite concerning as he takes another long think here, tries to figure out which alternative is better. Does he want to keep the knights on the board and go knight g4 or knight d3, or does he want to trade on f7? He can even force a rook endgame. He can take on f7, and then after queen takes e3 check, he can go queen f2 and force the trade of queens. That is probably the fastest way toward a draw, but Garry probably feeling a little bit more ambitious. After all, he was up a pawn out of the opening. I don't think he wants to acquiesce to a draw this early, but it might be time to do that. That might be the wise decision as he continues to contemplate his next move. He's down to close to a minute. What is Garry going to do? As he leans in and back out, vintage moves. He seems frustrated. He still hasn't made a move. He has to start playing fast here. And knight g4 is what he decides on. Immediately, Leinier goes h5. Knight back to f2. Leinier takes the pawn back on e3. Now I think Black is basically, in pretty good shape here. White's now got a bunch of weak pawns. The queen on e3, though, could end up being vulnerable. First of all, Garry has to defend the pawn on f4, and he does with the move g3. Now, will Leinier bring his rook into the game with rook a to e8? That seems incredibly logical, and that also prevents rook a to e1, because Black will just take on e1 and get 2 rooks for the queen. And with White's king being as vulnerable as it is, 2 rooks for a queen seems to be in Black's favor here. So rook a e8 seems really reasonable for Leinier. Garry shaking his head. He had a good position out of the opening, but wasn't able to cling to his extra pawn. Let's see what Leinier decides on here. He is taking a pretty significant think. And it is rook a to e8. Now, Garry needs to find a way to get active. His knight is pinned. His queen is tied up. Queen g6. Very interesting move by Garry. He hits the pawn on h5. He abandons his queen side, so Leinier could start mopping up those pawns. He can play queen takes c3 here, and then even queen takes b3 is on the cards. But then he'll have to give up the h5 pawn, and black will have some worries with his own king safety. I like that practical chance. I think queen g6, very, very good practical move, and it poses another decision in front of black. Leinier taking his own time, trying to figure out what to do. He can also push the pawn down to h4 and try to give it up on his own terms. Glances over at the clock, and other than taking the pawn on c3 and going h4, I don't see too many other options. I mean, black can defend it with queen f3, but that walks right into a potential discovered attack because of the rook on f1. So queen f3, queen e2, both of those moves look a little bit flimsy, but maybe Leinier doesn't want to part ways with that h-pawn, because every pawn that disappears on the king side is bad news for black. And he does go for queen f3. Interesting decision there. And now his queen, very, very precarious. We're going to see a major acceleration of play as both players now low on time. Will Garry defend the pawn? No, he'll go rook a to e1. He'll contest the e-file. He continues to offer that c3 pawn up. But if Leinier takes it, once again, he'll have to give up his h-pawn. And he was about to get a hold of his rook, but now he hesitates. Will Leinier trade on e1? Yes, he does. He gives up the e-file, and he goes knight to h6. So he still doesn't take the c3 pawn, but that is a bit of an odd choice. I thought Leinier had to take the pawn on c3. Now Garry has control of the e-file. He can even infiltrate with rook e7, but then Leinier is planning knight f5, defending g7 and hitting the rooks, pushing his chair and his Garry. You can see the anxiety. Queen back to d3, offering a queen trade. That's a very prudent decision. Leinier forced to trade queens. Now White's in great shape in this endgame. He's got control of the e-file, and he goes to a5, freezing black's queenside pawns. Now the knight can jump into c5. Leinier getting his king in. Knight e5 check. You can't go up to f6. He has to go back. This is deteriorating for Leinier. b4 expanding on the queen side. Rook e8, king f2, bringing the king up. How does Leinier untangle? He goes a6, but now look at that b7 pawn. That's an incredibly weak pawn, and Garry goes for it. Knight d7. He wants to get his knight to c5 and tie black down. We have a trade of rooks. This is probably still closer to a draw than to anything else, but Garry definitely in the driver's seat. He's got a pawn majority on the king side that he can exploit right about now. h3, g4, and he can keep expanding as he first... he goes h3. He's going to bring his king into f3 as well. g4 first, expanding on the king side. Garry, only one who can win this game right now. He's in phenomenal shape. Leinier keeps looking over at the clock. g5 and king f3, pushing the king up, preparing to get a pass pawn. Leinier goes king g6. Black basically can do nothing, but how does Garry improve his position? Will he go f5? He does. He establishes a protected pass pawn on f5. Now he's getting his king toward the center. Knight c4, king d4. Leinier has to go back to d6. Knight b7 check, pushing black's king back. Now knight c5. Garry repeating once. How does he make progress? Back to d3 he goes. Leinier has to move his own king back and forth. King e3. So far, Garry not seeming to find a way to make progress. King f6. Black teetering on the brink. King d4, knight b5 check. He has to go back to d3 again. Is this going to be a draw by repetition? Garry is trying to force Zugzwang. Knight c4. I think he has to go back to d7. I think he has to go back to d7 and push black's king off of f6, but Garry not seeing it yet. And he has to be very careful about three-time repetition. Knight e6. He's paving the way for his king to go to c5. I think he wants his king to tackle those queenside pawns. This is a really, really hard thing to defend against in time pressure. And now knight d8. Now Leinier has to go back to d6 and king c5. Here comes Garry's king. I think this is winning for white. Knight e4 check, king b6. And black will lose all of his pawns. Knight takes c3. Leinier taking one pawn, but Garry's going to take the pawn on a6. I think this is winning for white. The knight is going to drop back to c5 and prevent the progress of the d pawn. Leinier going after the b pawn, but Garry, he's left with the most valuable pass pawn in the position. He has the passed a pawn, and he has contained all of the pawns. He sacrifices his knight, and here comes the a pawn. And I don't think Leinier can stop it. I don't think Leinier can stop the pawn. He cannot. White is going to promote, and he resigns. What a display by Garry Kasparov. He keeps his cool in time pressure. An amazing game. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to click on the link to the playlist that's popping up on your screen. I'm GM Daniel Naroditsky. Hope you enjoyed this incredible game between Garry Kasparov and Leinier Dominguez. Thank you for watching.